On this edition of Alberta Dugout Stories, the podcast, he penned the biography of our province's most famous baseball wordsmith. Willie Steele joins us. Welcome to episode 153 of Alberta Dugout Stories, the podcast. I'm Joe McFarland. With the baseball season coming to a close here in Alberta, we thought we'd switch things up on this episode to bring on someone we've wanted to chat with for a while. Willie Steele is the author of Going the Distance, The Life and Works of W.P. Kinsella. Released in 2019, it's the biography of the Alberta-born scribe, most famous for the novel Shoeless Joe. Kinsella was born and raised in the Edmonton area and also spent some time at the University of Calgary among his many travels. Steele has been a big supporter of us, sharing our stories and even writing one of his own for us on his experience at the Field of Dreams game earlier this season. So we thought we'd check in with him, but also introduce you, our podcast listeners, to Willie and what he knew of Alberta's most famous baseball wordsmith. Willie, thanks so much for joining us here on the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me back on. I appreciate it.
What initially inspired you to tell the story of W.P. Kinsella?
Oh, gosh. I never know where to start with that question. You know, I've been asked that several times, and I guess when I was 16 years old and went to the movies by myself and saw everybody else was going to go see Indiana Jones, and I went to go see Field of Dreams. And it kind of mapped out. I didn't know it then, but it mapped out the trajectory of my professional life for sure. I did my master's thesis on Kinsella's novel Shoeless Joe and the movie Field of Dreams, looked at father-son relationships. When I was looking for a dissertation topic as I finished my PhD, I looked at baseball and different types of identity in Kinsella's baseball novels. And at that point, I thought, okay, I've written everything I can on Kinsella. I ended up getting that published as my first book with McFarland Press, a member of the local 9, and Kinsella got a hold of it and emailed me. And you know, if you know much about Kinsella, you know he didn't have a whole lot of flattering things to say about academics or literary theorists. And I'm a professional academic whose degree is in literary theory. So when he emailed me, I thought, well, this is pretty cool. You know, he had nice things to say. And then a couple of weeks later, in November of, I guess it was 2012, he emailed me and said, hey, you know, I'd like to have my biography written, and, you know, I like the work you've done. Would you be interested in doing it? And I didn't know what I was getting myself into. I said, yeah, sure. How hard could it be? And then I spent the next 6 years learning how hard it could be. It was, you know, early on, it was a moment of inspiration to get the academic work done, but then it was just a matter of convenience, really. I mean, Kinsella reached out to me and asked me. So, you know, I figured, what's the worst thing that could happen? So I said yes.
Obviously, you get built and you have to kind of work around free time and that kind of thing. When he first reached out to you and you started thinking about it and then you give the ultimate yes, did you have an idea as to how you wanted to go about the research and the interviews and all of those pieces to it, or did you kind of go into it with a bit of an open mind?
Well, I went into it. I asked some friends of mine at different baseball conferences, academic conferences I go to, and a friend of mine, Lee Lowenfish, wrote the biography of Branch Rickey, who was the general manager that signed Jackie Robinson to the Dodgers. And I asked Lee, I said, you know, I've agreed to do this biography, but I've never written one. I don't know where to start. You know, do you have any advice? And Lee said something along the lines of, if you're going to write a biography, choose a topic, a character who's already dead, a person who's already dead, and then kill his family. And I didn't think that was very helpful because at the time, Kinsella and his family were all alive. But I understand it now because whenever you interview somebody, you know, Kinsella would open up his day planner and say, well, you need this number, or you should call this person. And then one interview led to 2, led to 4, led to 8, and they just kept expanding and expanding. And so I really went into it. I kept an open mind. Like, I didn't want to say, you know, well, I don't need to talk to that person, because I thought, well, that person might have something, you know, interesting to say. And so I kept an open mind as far as that goes, but I eventually had to just stop researching because I could have kept going. There's everybody has a Kinsella story. You talk to somebody in Canada, and they're wanting to talk about the Silas stories, and somebody down here wants to talk about the baseball stories. Somebody wants to talk about Field of Dreams. And then Kinsella himself gave me access to everything, and I'm, that's when I say everything. I mean he sent me home the first time I went up to his house. He sent me back with 40 years of his personal diaries, his day planners with notes, and he would mail me 500 pages of autobiographical notes he made back in the early 80s, and he gave me access to everything at the archives in Burnaby and in Ottawa, and he never said no to a question. And so I was really, at multiple times throughout this process, I was overwhelmed just by the sheer volume of stuff. And so, I kept an open mind, but eventually I just had to, like I said, I had to stop the researching and start the writing. But it was an interesting process for sure. I had no idea that one man could keep that much stuff throughout the years.
Did anything about him, personality-wise, take you by surprise? Because he was a different kind of gent by the sounds of it, and yet he seems as though he was very open and transparent with you.
Yeah, the thing that really surprised me is, and he would be the first to admit this, he could hold a grudge like nobody else. There were things in the files there at the Library Archives Canada in Ottawa that, as I'm reading, he wrote these things about somebody or something, some slight that was done against him or whatever back 35 years earlier. And when I talked with him, I'd say, well, it seemed like you were pretty upset at the time. And he would still harbor a grudge, 3.5 decades later. But I also think because of that, that's part of what motivated him. He kept a file full of rejection letters, and some of them were just pretty rude, like pretty mean. I mean, I think anybody who's been in the business, writing long enough, gets their share of rejections. But he saved them, and it really seemed to be what fueled him in some cases. And so that was a little bit surprising. But on the flip side of that, there were some things where he just had these just really beautiful things to say about his daughters, Shannon and Aaron. There were a couple of letters that were in the files there that he had saved copies of that he had written to them. And I didn't include them in the book because I thought they were incredibly beautiful letters, very touching from father to his daughters. And I felt like those were between them, but it was two very different sides of the same guy. One is like really just bitter, vindictive, so mean-spirited, really in some ways. But the flip side of that is he was also incredibly warm and loving. And, if you were on his good side, you knew it. But if you were on his bad side, you were going to know that too.
Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about his upbringing. Obviously, this is Alberta Dugout Stories. He's very well known from being from this province, the Edmonton region, grew up in rural Alberta. He also did some work at the University of Calgary. He obviously has some pretty strong connections here.
Yeah. He lived the first 10 years of his life in Darwell, which is 60 miles or so outside of Edmonton, or was when he was born. And his mom wanted him born in, she wanted him born in civilization, so that was a deal she had made with her husband. And after 10 years, as a 10-year-old kid, his mom had felt that she had educated him, homeschooled him about as much as she could. He had gone to a little schoolhouse there for a while, but then she wanted him to be in town near other kids. And so in the, I think it was about August of 45, right at the end of World War II, they moved into Edmonton. And, those first 10 years of being essentially the only kid on this farm, didn't have a lot of playmates around. He developed a very strong imagination, and he told me multiple times that he felt that was where he started to develop his chops as a fiction writer, creating characters in his head and things like that. And then when he moved into Edmonton, he learned how to kind of navigate the world of, the rest of elementary school and then middle grades and high school. Never felt like he fit in, but by all accounts, he was well liked. He knew he wanted to be a writer, but he had counselors and teachers who never really encouraged him. They said, well, that's more of a hobby. And that was one of those grudges he's held for many years. The guidance counselor at his high school told him he wouldn't be able to make a living as a writer, but he could do it for fun. And when Kinsella went back decades later to speak to that high school, he told those kids that there's a special place in hell for that guidance counselor for telling a kid, And so he didn't hold back. And this was probably 50 years or more later. And but he, as you said, he did have strong connections there. His time at University of Calgary was not his favorite time. He loathed teaching. He felt like it was too much administrative garbage and not enough actual teaching. He felt that a lot of the students shouldn't be allowed anywhere near a university campus, and so he not so lovingly referred to University of Calgary as Desolate U. As soon as he could get out of there, after he had made the money and gotten the reputation with Shoeless Joe, he got out of there and never looked back.
Where did the fascination with baseball come for him?
The beginning of Shoeless Joe, where he talks about his father, my father saw him play, and years later, and talking about Shoeless Joe, those were stories that his dad, John Kinsella, told him as a kid. His dad was American, and was in the Army, and after the war kind of bounced around, played some semi-pro ball, claimed to have seen the Chicago White Sox, that year, 1919, and so he told him those stories, and that kind of planted the seed. Kinsella was a casual baseball fan, but once Shoeless Joe took off in '82, he really, he was asked to do a lot of baseball events, writing articles for TV Guide and attending, World Series game. When the Blue Jays won in the '90s back to back, he was there, writing things for the Blue Jays. And so he became a much more passionate baseball fan the older he got. But he realized that there was a market for fiction that has baseball in it, and so he said, once I realized that, it was like a gold miner who taps into a vein of gold. You just keep mining it until every last nugget is out of there. So he spent the next several years writing baseball fiction.
That part always fascinated me because, and granted, Alberta has a fairly rich baseball history, but at the same time, it's still, third on the line of sports realistically when you look at hockey and football probably being the preeminent sports. Even back then when he was growing up, they would have been those sports that were front and center, and baseball was probably third. And so it always kind of made me wonder what it was about the game that sort of drew him to it.
Yeah, when he was little, he would follow as much as he could, hearing games on the radio and, Cardinals games in the World Series in the 40s. He would listen to those, and he would follow teams. He said he was always drawn to the exotic nature of some of these cities, like, Ogden, Utah, or Salt Lake City, these far-off places to a kid in Western Canada. And he kind of followed it along that way. And then when he moved, when the Kinsella family moved to Edmonton, he would attend. I can't remember off the top of my head the name of the league that was back there in the 40s. But they would go and do specials where he could get in for a nickel or a dime or whatever and watch a game. And he would go catch some games there. But like I said, he wasn't a really a rabid fan or a passionate fan until years later. And then he attended games. He and his wife Ann at the time were season ticket holders for the Mariners, and would go down to Seattle quite often. And of course, he followed Toronto when they were doing well, and he's passed that on. Both of his daughters follow baseball now too. So this is kind of started with John Kinsella back over 100 years ago, and continues today with his kids.
Did he have a favorite piece that he had written, or was he always sort of in the mindset of I'm only as good as the next story I write?
Yeah, there were some that he liked. I think he had a particular fondness for Shoeless Joe Jackson Comes to Iowa, which was the short story that he wrote really as a tribute to the people and the landscape of Iowa. He went to the Iowa Writers Workshop, And when he left there to go take the teaching job in Calgary, he wrote that story and thought, well, that's kind of a one and done. And then a editor's assistant in Boston read it and encouraged him to turn it into a novel, which of course became Shoeless Joe. And so I think just simply because of what that did for his career, there was always a fondness there. There's another short story he really liked and was proud of called The Night That Manny Mota Tied the Record.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was when it was based on a game just a few days after Thurman Munson died. The Yankees catcher died in a plane crash in 1979. And, he wrote that story not long after that game took place. And so there were stories like that he always kept coming back to and said, I think I really was able to do something with that one that has some staying power. And I really like, this one for whatever reason. But yeah, I mean, he said, you're only as good as, you're as good as your last story. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the most interesting thing he told me about writing was that he wished that he had written Shoeless Joe later in his career.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked him why, and he said, well, the problem is that everything after Shoeless Joe was compared to Shoeless Joe.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the people who really loved that novel, nothing else was ever going to measure up. And he said, I thought that in some ways the Iowa Baseball Confederacy, his second novel, came out in '86. He said, in some ways it's a better novel, but it doesn't get the credit because it's not Shoeless Joe,
Right.
And I think there's a point to that. I think that a lot of critics have kind of dismissed some of his other novels in particular because, the staying power that Shoeless Joe has as a result of Field of Dreams.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of Field of Dreams, how did he take the movie? Was he on board from the get-go, or was that something that you kind of hold a bit of a grudge towards?
No, he loved it. He said he was never one to collaborate with other people. And so when they reached out, Phil Robinson got the rights and was going to make a script, write the script, and he reached out to Kinsella, and Kinsella it was like a 3-page single-spaced letter that Phil wrote, and he's, I'm going to have to make some changes, I'm going to have to do this, do that. And Bill was in Hawaii. He used to spend his winters in Hawaii, and he wrote Robinson a postcard and said, "Dear Phil, do what you have to do. Love, Bill." And Robinson would send updates to Kinsella just to kind of keep him posted. And when he sent him the first draft of the script in '87, when Bill read it, when Kinsella read it, he teared up. He was blown away by what Phil had done with the script. And then when the movie came out, they went to a premiere up in Canada, and he teared up again. He said, I can't believe these are my own words making me do this, making me cry. And he was always very complimentary of Phil Robinson for the work he did, and I think this is the highest praise coming from Bill Kinsella was he said I couldn't have done a better job myself with it. And so he didn't have a whole lot of good things to say about the business side of the movie, movie making, but he was always very complimentary of the work that Phil did on that film.
Interesting. 1997, quite the year for him. Gets into a car crash, almost ends his writing career. How life-changing was that for him? Not just in the macro and just that, but even in the micro, the day-to-day operations in which he worked.
Yeah, so he was always a very disciplined writer. He was somebody who would write for 2 days and do a quota of a minimum of 4 pages each day for 2 days. And then on the third day, he would type what he had written or do editing the equivalent of 4 pages. And so he was always working on something. And he always had multiple stories in play at one time. So if he's hit writer's block on this story, he would shift gears and pick up this novel and work on it. When that wreck happened, he and his fourth wife, Barb, were out for a walk, and a van backed out and hit Bill, and he hit his head on the sidewalk. And there were all sorts, had some teeth knocked loose and had some headache issues, concussions, things like that. But and lost his senses of taste and smell. But for him, the most troubling part was that he lost his ability to write creatively. And so he would still do book reviews or do an op-ed piece for the paper, but it was more than a decade before he started writing creatively again. And so the things that were published after 97 up until Butterfly Winter came out in 2011, the things that were being published were things that had already been written before the accident.
Right.
He went from being a very type A, disciplined person with regimented writing habits to being somebody who really just kind of, very, whatever happens type thing, and not disciplined at all. Years later, when he wrote Butterfly Winter and got it published, his wife, fourth wife Barb, was dealing with some significant health issues, and while she was in the hospital, he would pick up his pen and start writing again, and so that really got him back into the habit of writing. But professionally, that was devastating, and I think looking back on it, that was the beginning of some of his significant health issues. He had always, battled diabetes and had some, ulcers and things like that. But that wreck in '97, I think, really caused some health problems that never entirely went away until he died.
One of the things that happens at certain points during your career in whether it's broadcasting or writing or that is that you get a little reminiscent. You think back on the days and look back at some of the things that you've accomplished in those later years. I assume he maybe did the same thing. He was acclaimed. He had the awards and that kind of thing. What did he think about those kinds of recognitions that he was receiving for the things that he had written, even if it was 25 or 30 or 40 years prior?
Yeah, it's funny because I agree with you that I think most of us do tend to get sentimental and kind of, you reflect back on some of your earlier things in the career and say, I'm really proud of that. Kinsella was proud of the fact that he was able to prove those people who said he couldn't be a writer wrong. Mm-hmm. He felt a sense of accomplishment there. He always wanted to make a living as a writer, and so, he was, commercially successful. I asked him just a week or so before he died, one of our last email exchanges while he was in the hospital there at Hope, BC. I said, what do you think your legacy will be? Like, how do you want to be remembered? And this is a line that he used multiple times in interviews. He said, I want to be remembered as somebody who was a good storyteller and would leave you with a smile on your face and a tear in your eye. And so I don't really think he ever got caught up in the accolades, the Leacock Medal or the Order of Canada or any of those things. He really was happy that he was able to be remembered and knew he was going to be remembered as a good storyteller. How
will you remember Mr. Kinsella?
It's funny because I knew him. People will say, what was it like to be friends with him? And I don't know that we were ever friends. Mm-hmm. It was a very professional relationship. Like I said, he never said no to an interview question or to a request for information about something. But I will remember him when I went up to his house. I guess it would have been the summer of 2013. I got in late, and so I'd stayed at a hotel down in Hope, and he was living up the river in Yale, and he came down and picked me up, and I remember we went to a Tim Hortons and got breakfast, and we pulled off into the parking lot and just had breakfast, and I'm watching this guy tear off pieces of his breakfast sandwich and feed this bird. And I thought, it's just such a weird, sort of surreal, I don't know what I expected, but seeing this just a really, this older guy, who's in his late 70s at this point, just having this really nice everyday moment was fun. And then when we went up to his house, doing the interviews, he was a very competitive Scrabble player in the U.S. and Canada. And as I was doing the interviews, he's sitting there playing multiple Scrabble games on his iPad. And, so I'll remember him first as a really great writer. I think that as far as not just Canadian writers, but, writers in general, I think Bill Kinsella is somebody who is sometimes overlooked, for a variety of reasons. But on a personal level, I'll just remember those, sitting around his kitchen table, going to Tim Hortons and just having these kind of everyday types of interactions, which was a really nice memory to have with him.
Mm-hmm. Looking back on the journey from a personal standpoint, did you learn anything about yourself while you were writing this book?
I never want to do another biography. Yeah, I did. I told my wife when I came back from meeting him for the first time, and he gave me all of these diaries and things, and we were exchanging ideas and stuff. There's a line in Shoeless Joe that the Burt Lancaster character, Moonlight Graham, in Field of Dreams says, and he says, hardly anybody recognizes the most significant moments of their lives while they happen. Mm-hmm. And I realized that me making the decision to go to that movie by myself when I was 16 years old was one of those moments. And as I'm sitting there at Bill Kinsella's kitchen table, talking with him, getting ready to write this biography, I realized none of this would have happened had I not done that. And you don't really think about that while these seemingly mundane moments are happening. But I tell my students, I said, it's amazing what happens if you just open up yourself to the opportunities, right? And it may be something as seemingly mundane as going to the movies, but you never know how that will set into, motion these things that will happen that 20, 30 years later, you're sitting down to write a biography. And so I learned that line, and that's one of my favorite lines in literature, is that, nobody recognizes, or hardly anybody recognizes, the most significant moments of their lives while they happen. And so don't overlook the things that don't seem to be a big deal.
Speaking of moments and big deals, the Field of Dreams experience, you wrote a little piece for us on our website about your personal experience with that. Yeah. Now, with the benefit of hindsight and being able to look back on it a couple of months later, what did it mean to you to be a part of that and to take that all in?
As you're saying that, I'm thinking back and I'm getting chills again. I've gotten to do a lot of really great things over the years, many of which involve sports. But I've gotten to see, world records fall in track and field. I've gotten, World Series games. I've never experienced anything like that Field of Dreams game. We got Shannon Kinsella, Bill's oldest daughter. She and her husband, Don, came down. My youngest daughter, Marianne, and I flew up. We met there, and it was, just the electricity there. You could feel it as you were turning off the interstate and going on the 2-lane roads, and you get back in these cornfields. And then everybody who watched the game, seeing the Yankees take the lead, and you thought, well, here we go again. And we had made a deal. My youngest daughter told me before the game, she said, "Daddy, I can't cheer for the Yankees. I just don't like them." And Shannon Kinsella turned to her and said, "You know what? My dad didn't like the Yankees either, so tonight we'll just all be White Sox fans." And so watching that home run, at the end, when Tim Anderson hit that pitch and the place just went nuts. It was one of those moments that you could not have scripted any better. And in fact, this was I'm glad that this happened for Shannon. There were strangers coming up to her that had found out who she was, and they were coming down saying, "Your dad couldn't have written a better story. This is like watching one of your dad's books come to life." And that was a really nice moment to see her, be able to hear the appreciation that people had for her dad's craft. But I tell you what, for all of the faults that Rob Manfred and Major League Baseball, all of the dumb decisions they've made in the past few years, they got that game right, and it's going to be a hard one to top, I'll tell you that.
What do you think Bill would have thought of that game?
Would have loved it. Shannon and I were talking about this. There's been a lot of talk in Iowa about the people that are wanting to build a variety of, ball fields and dormitories and, have these tournaments that are going to be played there. And Kinsella was all about, look, this is a commercial enterprise. If you can make money off of it, make money off of it. And he never understood why Don Lansing, the guy that owned the farm on which the movie site set, he never understood why Don didn't charge $20. Right. He said, it's in the book. He said, people will pay $20. And he said, I don't get it. He said, I'd be making money hand over fist. And so Shannon and I were kind of laughing about that, saying, he would have absolutely loved it. He would have loved the publicity that it generated, the book sales that it generated, and the cherry on top would, of course, have been the game itself, with that terrific ending. And so Shannon and I both were 100% in agreement that Bill Kinsella would have been just giddy over the whole experience.
One of the things that I always took away from that book and from the Field of Dreams movie is the relationship between father and son. You had the opportunity to experience that game with one of your daughters. What was that like?
Yeah, it was terrific. I took my own dad died unexpectedly about 2 months after Bill Kinsella died in 2016, and I took my dad's ball glove with me, and Marianne, my daughter, had her ball glove, and so we went out on the movie site, the field, and just played catch. And we were throwing the ball, and I'm looking around, and there are literally hundreds of people just kind of roaming around. Several dozen were throwing balls. I saw guys in their 80s, kids that are 4 or 5 years old, and everybody was out there just having a good time. And I thought, this is a pretty cool moment to be able to do this with my daughter. And we finished playing catch, and then we got to walk through the cornfield to where the stadium was, where the game was being played. And it's hard being a parent of a teenager because dads aren't supposed to be cool, right? We embarrass our kids. And when we walk through the corn, Marianne stopped dead in her tracks and looks up and goes, "Whoa, Dad, this is cool." And I knew, okay, this is, no matter what happens on this trip, this is worth it right here. And so it was a fantastic moment, and one that I wouldn't trade for anything.
Do you find yourself almost pinching yourself in that situation, almost that moment of, I got to soak this in? Like you said, sometimes you don't really notice the moments until they're long gone. Do you try to, in those moments, be cognizant of the fact that it is one of those moments?
Yeah, that was one. That was a night where you knew this is a special moment. This is, without sounding, like a cliche, it is a once in a lifetime. It's the first major league ball game in Iowa. This is the first time that everything that we saw that night: first base hit, first stolen base, first home run. All of these things are first, and so that was kind of cool. But being able to experience it with your kid, it just takes it to the whole next level. And it was funny because I'm looking, and behind us we saw Dwyer Brown, who plays John Kinsella, the dad in the movie, and looking across the a few sections over, Kevin Costner was sitting there, and it was really cool to see that. But I'm watching them, and I'm like, they're just kicked back watching a game and enjoying themselves the same way that Marianne and I were, and it was really neat to be able to see that and experience that. But yeah, it was one of those things that a couple of times I just sort of sat back and looked and thought, how in the world did I end up here? And I don't question it. I'm along for the ride. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity that Bill Kinsella gave me to do that.
What's next for you?
Oh, well, in the short term, grading a stack of papers on my desk. But in the long term, I'm working on a project, a book about baseball in the weeks following 9/11, and I'm looking at the teams that were closest to the crash sites on September 11th. And so, obviously, the Mets and Yankees for New York, the Pittsburgh Pirates were the closest team to Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and then the Baltimore Orioles were the closest team to Washington, D.C. at the time, near the Pentagon. And so I'm looking at, kind of how 9/11 impacted those teams and how baseball kind of helped the country, let's say heal, but at least be able to get through those days and weeks that were pretty dark there in the fall of 2001. And so I've been researching it. I had actually started it before Bill reached out to me, and then that took several years, and so I've been going back and doing some of the research. So I hope to be able to get that one ready in the next couple of years.
Very cool. Well, very much appreciative of the conversation. The final question I have for you is one that we ask all of our guests here on the podcast. What does the game of baseball mean to you?
Oh, gosh. It's funny, like, because it depends on what day you ask me, right? Like opening day, I love the optimism. Every team is in first place. Now I'm a Pittsburgh Pirates fan, and that's usually the only time that we're in first place. But to me, it's optimism. You know, if you go 0 for 4 today, you know what? You get to come back and do it again tomorrow. You get a second chance, and so I love the optimism and the opportunity for redemption that's built into an entire season. I love that about the game, and I think that's some of the stuff that's in the fiction that Bill wrote too. Is just the unlimited possibilities that the game provides.
Willie, really appreciate your time again here on the podcast. Thanks so much for delving into not only the book, but also the movie and the game as well. Really appreciate all your work. Thanks so much for joining us here on the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks again to Willie Steele for joining us, and as I mentioned to him off air, we want to thank him as well for all of the support he's given us over the years in sharing our stories with his followers. We'd also like to take a moment to thank our 2 Platinum supporters for their generosity. The Okotoks Dogs have been with us from the very beginning as a sponsor and are always quick to share our stories. Make sure to check them out at dogsbaseball.ca. And Absolute Human Performance recently joined us with our new tiered supporter package. They're up to some great things in the capital region, so check them out at absolutehumanperformance.com. Until next time, thanks for all of your support, no matter the platform, of Alberta Dugout Stories.